Hi there, welcome back friends. Good to see you. This has been another really busy week for me as we wrap up the semester. So today I just wanted to show you some of the supplies that I like to use when I do watercolor paintings. So join me over at the table and we'll go over some materials. Alright, you beautiful people, let's talk about some watercolor painting supplies. So first I'd say would be paint, what to look for with paint, and there's different grades of paint. I really could go on and on and on talking about supplies. I'm kind of a art supply nerd. Any of my students would be able to tell you that. So there are professional grade paints and student grade paints. I haven't tried a lot of the paints and I haven't tried a lot of the different papers. I'm just going to show you what I like and what works for me. There are so many different paint companies out there, and you can find a lot of review videos on YouTube where some other YouTubers, they have tested, dozens of different types of paints and papers. So I'm just going to show you what I like to use. So as far as student grade paint, I've used Grumbacher Academy paints and Winsor Newton Cotman paints, and they work fine. They are a great place to start. And then I tried using some professional grade paints, and there really is a difference. The professional grade paints have a higher concentration of pigment, so they're going to be stronger colors. And then what I think is the most notable difference is that the professional grade paints, they re-wet a little bit better than the student grade paints. So if you have a tube color in the student grade paint and it dries, you can still put water on it again and re-wet it, but it doesn't come up as easily as the professional grade paints. So I'll show you that here in a second. The paint brands that I have kind of settled on for right now are Winsor Newton, the professional grade Winsor Newton Artist Paint, and then the M. Graham Artist Watercolor. They're both professional grade paints. The most important thing to look for is that the permanence. You want to look for permanence either 1 or 2 or permanence A and light fastness so that they're not going to fade on you over time. And any good paint will have they'll have labels on there. It will show you the light fastness and the permanency of the paint. So I really like the Winsor Newton and the M. Graham colors. I prefer using tube colors as opposed to the cake colors. I think a lot of us are exposed to watercolor when we're very young, and we have a kind of a bad experience with it because we usually use the Crayola tin where there's maybe 6 or 7 of those little oval dry cakes of watercolor, and you have to scrub it for hours before you can actually get color on there. That's an exaggeration. And they have a horrible paintbrush with it, so it's just not a great experience. The liquid colors, or the tube colors, it's a lot easier to get a big wash down rather than getting a cake color that you have to scrub for a long time. The higher quality the cakes of color, the easier they will re-wet, but I still like using the tubes, especially if there's a large area of the painting I need to cover quickly. So that's it for paint so far. I'll try to put a list of my favorite colors I like to use down in the description. So after that, brushes. Brushes can be very expensive with watercolor painting, especially if you get things like Kolinsky Sables, where a medium-sized brush can cost you anywhere from $70 to $100. So I've tried to find some things that are good quality but also economical, and I've just been sticking with synthetic brushes lately. So these are some brushes from Hobby Lobby. They're the Masters Touch brand. And it is a synthetic squirrel hair. Squirrel hair has been used for a long time for watercolor brushes. They make these what they call mop brushes out of squirrel hair. And the squirrel hair holds a lot of water and a lot of color, and then they also come to a nice point and hold their shape well. but they can be pretty expensive. So I've tried these out lately and I'm really happy with them. The Master's Touch Synthetic Squirrel brushes. So if you go to Hobby Lobby and check them out, I really like them. I got the biggest one they make, the size 24 here. And this is great for doing large washes, and it also comes to a pretty nice point, so I can actually do pretty detailed strokes with that as well. So I have a couple rounds of that. I also have a flat in that, so you might want a few different shapes, but the round you can do quite a bit with. I can get away with most things just using the round. I use the square if I'm doing architectural things where I need very sharp corners. So those are the Master Touch brushes. Let me show you here how this holds its shape. I got some water over here. So once you wet it, it really comes to a nice point and it holds a lot of color in there. I'll show you some practice on some paper here in a little bit. So I like those brushes. They work very well. They don't have a lot of spring to them. That's another thing I like in a brush is when it snaps back. So it'll hold its shape, and you know, once you press down and lift up, it gets back to a point, but there's not a real snap to it. So I found these Princeton Elite brushes, and this is still synthetic. It's kind of a synthetic version of a Kolinsky Sable. And so these, I think, have a very nice balance of holding a lot of water and also coming to a nice point, and they have a little more snap than those Hobby Lobby brushes. So you can see once I get water on there, you can create a very fine point and just a little bit more spring to it. So these two brands of brushes I'm really happy with. You know, there's lots of other companies and much more expensive brushes you could use. Like this one I got at Michael's for maybe $12 or so. That's a size 12. That's a very nice brush, good size. You can get some larger washes and some fine detail with that. I've also got some other brushes in that line. I have a couple flats. I have some smaller brushes for details. And then aside from that, I like having some of these small brushes. This is a rigger brush. This is by Royal Langnickel, so it's not either of the brands that I've shown you. But these brushes with the very long bristles, these work great if you have to put in long tree branches or ropes on a sailboat or something like that. So try to get a few different shapes and sizes of brush. And I'd say the most important thing is that it holds a good amount of water and it holds its shape well. After that, we have to think about paper. And paper really is the most important part of watercolor painting. Going back to talking about those Crayola pan colors, those little oval colors, that's very difficult to paint with. And then we usually use those on just regular copier paper or something, and then we start seeing the paper tear apart. So you want a good quality paper when you're working. It makes a world of difference. You can use things like these student grade papers. They're fine for practice and such, but I think also, even with these, even though it says watercolor paper, you're going to get frustrated with it. It doesn't hold the paper as well as a professional grade paper, which I'll show you in a second here. So this kind of stuff I'll use for practice, or if I'm just doing color swatches to test my colors on. But this is basically a wood pulp paper, just like regular printer paper. What you want to look for is 100% cotton rag paper. Things like companies like Arches and Canson, look at the labels and make sure it says 100% cotton rag. It was basically made out of fabric. It's more of like a fabric than a paper, and it holds the color so much better than those regular wood pulp papers. So there really are dozens of different companies that make watercolor paper. I've only tried a few of them. By other people's recommendations. I started with Arches watercolor paper, and it's still my favorite paper to work with. I think it takes the color very well. Even in the Arches company, there are different types of paper, there's different weights, different finishes. So my favorite is the Arches 140 pound cold pressed watercolor paper. They also make hot press, which is a lot smoother, and they also make heavier paper, like a 300-pound and rough texture. I think that the 140-pound cold press for me is right in the sweet spot. It's got enough texture on there that you can create some interesting effects with your brushes, and it holds the color very well. The hot press, this is Arches, this is Canson, but regardless of the brand, the hot press is a smoother paper, and it's a little bit easier for the paint to lift up. So if you get a wash down there and then you try to put another wash on there, it might lift up the color you have already put down. Some artists prefer the hot press because it's a smoother paper, and they can make their textures rather than the paper dictating their texture. Let me show you a little bit of the texture that happens with those. And while I'm at it, I might as well jump into talking about palettes. This has been my favorite palette. I got this at Hobby Lobby as well. It's kind of a traveling palette. I like that it's got these separate wells for all the different colors, and then it's also got some big mixing areas here. And then there's a little secret. If I lift this tray out, I've got another tray underneath there. So I've got a lot of space for mixing. You can use many things for a palette. You could use even like a wax-coated paper plate. A butcher tray has been a pretty common palette for many artists. I don't really like having a mixing surface with just one large central area, because the watercolor is going to run all over the place, and you might have colors mixing that you don't want to mix. That's why I like to at least have some separate wells to mix my main colors in. You can actually use, if you get some little ceramic bowls or plates, and just use little separate bowls for your different colors. But in general, this works well for me for just about anything I'm doing, whether it's studio painting or plein air painting. It's compact, it holds a lot of color, and has a lot of space to mix on. One of the reasons people don't like plastic palettes, and this is a plastic palette, is that it can stain, and then also the plastic it makes the water bead up, and when the water just beads up on it, it's kind of hard to tell what color you're mixing. To counteract that, I've actually taken like a Scotch-Brite scrub pad, and I just scuffed this up a little bit, and that helps the paint stay in pools rather than just beading up. Another nice thing about this palette is there's a little rubber gasket around the lid here, and then there's a little raised ridge around the other side of the palette. So when you close it up and lock it down, that little rubber gasket prevents the paint from leaking out, which is something you got to be concerned about when you're traveling. So like I said, I got this at Hobby Lobby. I'm not sure if they carry this anymore. I don't even remember the brand name, but I know I have seen other brands that make a similar palette, so I'll try to post a link for that down in this description. Alright, so what I was going to show you is the different textures that the paper can give us. Just kind of jumping ahead, another piece of equipment that's really helpful to have is a spray bottle. You can use it to re-wet your paint. So as I mentioned, the professional paint re-wets really well. So I'm just spraying this down to get it activated again. So the spray bottle works well for that. It works well for keeping your paper wet if you're trying to do a large wash and you need that to stay wet. Okay, so I want to show you the difference in texture from the cold press to the hot press. Load up some color here. And if you can, hopefully you can see that. You can see on the palette it's staying spread out in a nice pool. It's not beating up into little dots of color. So this is a Winsor red from Winsor Newton. So there's the hot press. You can see it's really smooth. It goes on very smoothly. And there's the cold press. You can see it gives a little bit of that dry brush technique. You can smooth it out on the cold press as well. It takes a little bit more water. But I like that ability to get some of that grainy texture. Oil paint and acrylic kind of have a texture to the paint surface already. But watercolor, you have to either mimic the texture or use the texture of the paper to give any different quality. You might want everything to look super smooth, like here on the hot press paper. So it is a very personal thing. I just like that cold press paper. right off camera here, I've got my water container, which is another important piece of equipment, and I just use a 1 gallon jug that I cut half of the front off, so I have a handle there still, and I can hold a lot of water in there. Not so practical for traveling and painting, but in the studio I like that. It's my favorite method of holding my water to clean my brushes and also to use to thin down the paint. Okay, so that is the paper. I talked about the palette already. A couple other tools that I find really helpful. So with your brushes, if you get some of these brushes, even though they're not super expensive, you do want to protect them. You don't ever want to store your brush with the bristle down. That can put like a permanent bend in the hairs there, and then it's hard to control your brush. You don't want it to get all splayed out. So I try to keep it protected. So I got this brush case here. It's got some nice little holders. There's different varieties, but just consider getting something to hold your brushes in and to protect them. You can see I've got different shapes and sizes here. As you're cleaning your brushes, just a regular old cheap dish sponge works really, really well. I will use paper towels most of the time while I'm painting, but this is really convenient if you're just cleaning your brush out and you need to dry it off before continuing. The sponge works great. It also works very nicely to wipe up your palette. What else here? I've got some PBO drawing gum or just masking fluid. I really like this brand. I'll try to put a link in the description for you. This has a very nice flow to it. Some masking fluids are really thick, and so it's hard to control them. With watercolor paper, you kind of want to try to use the paper as your white. There is white opaque paint you can mix with your colors, but it looks a little more vibrant and luminous if you're just able to use the white of the paper. So if you've got a lot of small little areas you want to stay white, this works great. It's just a liquid that you can use a cheap brush and paint on, and then it dries and it resists the paint, and then you can peel it back up after the paint is dried, and it leaves you with some of those nice white little marks that you'll need. So the masking fluid is very helpful. A toothbrush. This can work nicely if you need to scrub something up. So I do like paper that holds the color. I don't want it to be super easy to wipe off, but sometimes if you need to scrub something out, the toothbrush works nicely. And you can use that to kind of get an effect if you had streaming light through a forest or something. So toothbrush, not absolutely necessary, but can come in handy. I mentioned the spray bottle already. And then a hair dryer. If you're doing a large painting and you have a big wash of wet paint on your paper, one of the most important things for watercolor painting is controlling how wet the paper is. So if your paper is soaking wet and then you try to put another wash of color on it right away, it's just going to bleed together. So you might want to speed up the drying process, and a hair dryer is the best way I know. If you're out plein air painting, most of the time, there's a breeze. As long as it's not really humid, the paint will dry pretty quickly out there. So that's another piece of equipment that I think is really helpful as you watercolor paint. Boy, I think that's about it as far as supplies. Techniques, that's a different thing. I'm getting ready to teach watercolor painting again next semester, so you can maybe anticipate me doing some watercolor demonstrations here in the near future. But I think that's about it for now with the watercolor supplies. So thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.